You'll see me getting up and down and wandering around. I recently was kicked in the back by one of my students. It was a self-inflicted injury for which I make no excuse except my own silliness. I sometimes forget I'm 72. I still like to fight. And you know, Pamela sent me a note saying it's okay to talk about the fighting spirit. And perhaps that will be the sort of underlining issue I'm going to speak to you about. First, I want to thank Cassie and the whole family. Chris Hill, Eve Steele, Herb, Robert, Gurley, Carolyn, Pamela, it goes on and on and on. And I've had years and years of fun with them. I don't know what my role exactly is. I asked one of them once, and they said, sort of, you're an international ambassador for Cassie, or you're a mentor to everybody. And so you'll see me making comments that I hope you don't take personally, because I have had more anxiety about this talk than I've had about any other talk I've given. And I talk all over the world all the time. And what I'm afraid of is I'm going to offend somebody. And I've been also told by a number of people that I'm not the only one with that issue. Nobody wants to talk about it because it might offend somebody. So I apologize in advance for that. Secondly, I'm going to speak to you with a peculiar background. Part of it's Maori and part of it's US. And I want to take this leaf and bury it with the Tainui canoe, if I may have permission, from the elders past and present who own this land. The connection between Maori and Aborigine should be an intimate one. Are there any Maori people here? I've seen a few around. Of course, New Zealand is very small, and the Maori people have a different background. I want to, now, let me just see if I can get this moving. No. Excuse me. First of all, who am I? That's a volcanic sand the Maori warriors would dig down into, and you can still do it, and get hot water. So you can bathe your muscles and bruises and cuts. It's in a little place called Kathia. This is my great-grandmother. She was an elder of the Maniapoto tribe, sub-tribe Ngāti Tupo. They were protectors of the king and essentially had that important function. Now, that is a person poking their tongue out at you. That is not a way of making you humiliated. It's a greeting. Haere maira, whitamana hiri tuarangi. Welcome to the guest from afar. The Maori attitude, although warrior-like, is gentle. The Native American attitude, although warrior-like, is gentle. The Aboriginal attitude, although warrior-like, is gentle. The question is, what in God's name has happened? That's the question. There's me. I had the same thing as my Maori mother. My Maori mother was the daughter of a prostitute. She married a white man and produced me. And she was adopted into a white family, a form of slavery, in which the Maori children were used to entertain the white children in wealthy white settling families in New Zealand. She never allowed me to speak about my Maori background. She said, "You are white." Anytime I asked about the Maori background, she said, "Don't talk about that." And that's exactly what she was told. You are white, you've been adopted into a white family, you are no longer Maori. So, she was considered, like an Aboriginal woman, to be unreliable and unstable. So what happened to me when I was 4, I was adopted into a white family, just as my mother was, and I got out of it, thank God, by going to the United States. And out of that, many things began to happen. I want to simply greet you as a Maori and a United States citizen. I value both citizenships immensely. What I've heard, particularly from the last speaker, is to me shocking. The extent of the brutality, the most violent country in the world is the United States. Its imprisonment rate is 539 per 100,000, a small fraction of the Aboriginal incarceration rate. The largest incarceration in the world was the Soviet Union before it collapsed, and it was about 570. So the incarceration rate of Aborigine is shocking, absolutely shocking. Now, I'm going to do this probably by flitting around here because I really don't know what to say. I know, for example, that, let me read something from a scientific paper. The sociocultural processes cannot aptly explain why in Australia, where social disorganisation was absent and life conditions were adequate, a plan to eradicate Australia's indigenous Aboriginal population occurred. Why did that happen? Another paper done on the apology. This particular group from Queensland University, in a small study, concluded that the apology was not sufficient, that there now needed to be action. Now, I get the feeling from Johnny and his boss that this is exactly what the Aboriginal now see as necessary. The question that I have from Marcia and to some extent Tim is, before that action can be seen as useful, for example, Marcia, if you are seen in what seems to be a classic double bind, Bateson-style double bind, whatever you say is wrong. It's like the old question, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Including nothing at all. All that does is make you inside feel completely tight and angry, with no outlet and nothing to say. And it seems to me that before action occurs, for example, you could not promote our AA services because that would be seen as a collusion with the white idea of treating the Aborigine and taking away from the Aborigine something they want to do. And you see, I mean, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So what has to happen? I was going to talk all about action, what things you can do. Now I think what has to happen is there has to be another talk done. And I have a suggestion. John Allardyce and Vamik Volkan be invited to Australia to address you. Vamik Volkan is an expert at getting people to talk about things that are unspeakable. What I've heard about what is happening now and what happened a century or more ago is unspeakable. I may be exaggerating, it would to me be like Adolf Hitler trying to apologize for the Holocaust. What can he say? And I was astounded to hear how much of that is still going on. Now, if you're going to get reconciliation, you have to have parties that have decided, as John gave very striking examples, where McGuinness, the second in command of the IRA, and Paisley, the amazing Protestant leader, said, this is getting us nowhere. And the thing that hasn't been said so far, I will say, what are we doing for our children? What example is this to the Aboriginal children that their parents cannot resolve enough to do anything? Where one of the leaders of the Aboriginal people, Marcia, cannot be allied with her own people because of fantasies about who's brought her off and what's actually going on. Why can we not talk? It's unfair, as John pointed out. humiliation. I cannot imagine anything more humiliating than those stories about imprisonment. It's almost too much to talk about. And so, I'm going to talk very briefly, contrary to what I put in here, about some things I think that must be discussed in some format. People are going to have to talk about what they don't want to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about this stuff. There are ideas fixed about the Aboriginal that Marcia described so perfectly that have created a sense of hopelessness, not only hopelessness in Aboriginal people, but every single cab driver, of the 10 cab drivers I've had since I've been a week in Australia, I asked them all about this. The last one said, "Oh, good luck, see you in 100 years." Not a single one of them thought anything good would come out of this conference. I'm sick to death of hearing about it. Let's talk about something more interesting. History blocks human contact. Now, why would I say that? This is a penal colony that had a very negative history. We heard some of that from Timothy this morning. The point I'm making is this is not a racial issue. This is a matter of, is the Aborigine less than human? Not that the white was superior, but dark was non-human. Now, I don't call that racism. And I believe that occurred in this country up to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The Aboriginal people were classified as goods and chattels. And finally, somebody found they were actually intelligent. Why was that? How can you apologize for treating a person who is human as an animal, as goods and chattels? No wonder Australia denies this issue. Why would anybody want to talk about it? And frankly speaking, what can you say about it? Now, if I was to change this community from a psychoanalytic perspective, the people that would change it are the Aborigine. It cannot be done by the white fellows. It has to come from within the group that needs it. That group is full of unconscious, festering wounds. And I'm going to go on later to show you a slide of what symptomatology results from complete denial and dissociation from what must be extraordinary rage that's unexpressed and maybe unexpressible. What has to happen is that the groups must come together, as John said, respectfully. They must give each other the respect of saying your opinion and my opinion are worth exactly the same. Your suggestions and my suggestions are worth the same. I had on this slide a series of ways we train people in those areas. And so now there is an issue. And you could read this just quietly to yourself and see if you agree with it. What may have happened here is that the native people have been degraded and victimized. The next phase is to blame them for the ills that follow, such as substance use disorders, domestic violence, crime, violence, criminalization of human weakness, and positive paths fade for reconciliation. Human weakness. How many of us in this room drink? Probably 75 to 90%. I usually drink more than my fair share. Why is that in fact a moral and criminal act of the Aborigine? Why is it treated that way? The younger generation of the oppressors mean well, but are blind to the depth of the pain and humiliation thrust into the culture of the oppressed. Using John's words again, humiliation is a destructive emotion beyond almost any other. I liken it to multiple rape in front of an audience. The oppressed are weary with words and judgments that trap them into chronic victimization, inviting dehumanized solutions, reinforcing unintended harm and defensiveness. In other words, there's a sense I have here that the Aboriginal culture is stuck in a state that technically a psychiatrist would call a state of anergia and anhedonia. This is exactly what happens in defective organizations in the United States. Over and over again, a non-functional organization that's having trouble, let's say, producing enough to keep its bottom line good, very frequently has set up a violent or bullying management structure that forces the people to remain silent because they will incriminate themselves. And so they simply take it out on simply going home whenever possible, taking a mental health day whenever they possibly can, arriving right on time and leaving right on time, and not putting a single thing into their work because they don't like it. If you're going to reconcile, you have to establish a series of similarities. Without going through all of these, you can just glance at them. I think essentially John captured it under the heading of respect. What is respect? Respect is the assumption that you're there for good reason and that you have the power to speak your mind without having to censor it. I wonder if my feeling of being frightened about this talk reflected a deep attachment to the Aboriginal people through a Maori descent, where I feel is so strongly now, I feel like shouting and screaming at you. That's how what I feel right now. I'm sick to death of this. None of those things sound like they're possible now. What Cassie has done under the leadership of Pamela Nathan, I love that term over there, make my spirit inside me good. What I suggest has to first happen to make that good is that the badness must be gotten out. And as John said, people tend to either internalize or externalize rage. Women tend to internalize it more than men, and it comes out of things like eating disorders, suicide attempts, and so on. And men tend to be more directly aggressive. But to make my spirit inside me good, there has to be a way of getting that aggression out without destructiveness. And this is where I want to bring an issue to the fore that Johnny and I have talked about quite a lot around the function of the police and around alcoholism. And that is the term sublimation. Coined by Anna Freud and not considered by many a defense, it's a way of managing a feeling by letting it leak out little by little in non-destructive activity. For example, you may put all your energy into building a business that beats everybody else in the field out of a job, and that would be managing your aggression. You might also take up Australian rules football, as Robert introduced me to. Or you might even take up American gridiron, which is like a bunch of Robocops. Has anybody ever seen American football? It's not sort of human, really, is it? These huge guys, they, the whole deal. I do combat arts, and I've done them for 40 years. That's a sublimation of aggression. I think if you take John's men's health clinic, and you motivate men to start doing work instead of grumbling, it'll be somewhat like a project we did in Angola, in which the murderous young people who were killing and shooting, we turned them to repairing roads. The roads were necessary for everybody to be able to communicate in Angola. And what happened to their aggression? It was sublimated. Is there a way in which the Aboriginal aggression, which may come out in a horrifying way if released by alcohol, alcohol has a way of drowning your conscience. Some of you who may have drunk too much have noticed that. You say and do things you don't normally want to do. But if you have a way of getting that relaxed feeling without drinking, and do something useful like repair a road and get a salary for it, and you might have done some good for people, and somebody comes up and said, you know, every time I went on that road, I couldn't stand it. I'm screaming with pain. My arthritis was so awful. You repaired it, and I got pain-free between two villages. Thank you very much, young man. Altruism. I call it pragmatic. Altruism is for yourself as well as others. You do good for others, and it will make you feel good. Could it be possible that young Aborigines can learn altruism? I don't want to connect it with Mother Teresa or any of the holy people. It's nothing to do with that. It's treat other people well and they'll treat you well back. But this situation is intolerable. Something needs to be done. Why would a famous Aboriginal academic not be listened to by the Royal Commission? Why? Now, so what's next? This isn't, well, let's just get over this. I want to get into something. Okay. What we've done with a lot of groups, and this includes Cassie's schools, is try and teach, and I'd be very interested to hear if this could be possible with the Aboriginal people, this type of thinking, which is called responsive or mentalizing thinking. The most important step is becoming aware of other people's minds and their belief systems, putting yourself in their shoes. If you are enraged, that's not possible. When John Allardyce pointed out, when you become enraged, I say you lose 20 IQ points. You become a dumb person immediately as a result of your hormones and your psychology. You develop a violent mindset that's very concrete. And you'd say, well, give me an example. And I'll give you one. It's probably not a person in this room who is not associated with another, like a wife or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, who has not had an endless battle about the same thing, right? Over and over and over again, right? And you know it's not going to get anywhere. And here it comes up again. And you say, I'm not going to get sucked into it this time. I'm not, because it never goes anywhere, and you get sucked into it. And then the skin and hair flies, not literally, and then it stops. Have you achieved anything? No. And then you say to yourself, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I hadn't said that. And I say to you, did something happen to your brain? Did somebody damage your brain? Is your brain different now than it was before? No. Yes, it is different. It's different because when you get angry, you are literally not thinking like an intelligent human being. You cannot until you come out of this mental state. This is what children are being taught in schools here. How to, whoever is to blame or wrong, it's better if you don't let yourself get sucked into one extreme or another that causes you to become an idiot. Because what I'm hearing, even though it's so awful, I also say the whites and the Aboriginals seem like a bunch of idiots fighting. Idiots not in the sense of being stupid, but being unable to talk. If you become reflective, in other words, think before you talk or act in any way, if you can put yourself in the shoes of another person and know your own limitations, if you could modulate anger without it overcoming you and you becoming an idiot, and if you could set up a situation where it isn't destructive to you, as John Allardyce said, all the violence seems to be self-destructive. In the end, nobody wins until somebody realizes that. Both parties said together in Ireland, our children are getting nothing out of this. Nothing will be won. Nobody will win this. It could go on for hundreds of years. What has to happen is that this process of mentalizing or responsive thinking has to occur. Now, I could come to Northern Territory and train this. And you know what I like to train it in, John? The police. Wouldn't that be interesting to see if they could be trained that way? Now, the other piece of it is this. Power is normal. Arguing is normal. Bullying is even normal. Let's say you don't want to go to a particular restaurant, so you say, we're not going there. That's bullying. Or you might say, I don't want to argue with you, take control. You're being a victim. Or you may just absent yourself from the decision and you're being a bystander to the whole process. These are normal things. These are not sicknesses. They're just the ways people use power. They determine each other. You can't have a victim without a victimizer. There's no meaning in the terms unless they coexist. Everybody's in these roles. And they are not diagnoses. These are not medical diagnoses. Now, where is the problem? The problem is, whoops. I was so tempted to push that button, I couldn't stop it. Now I'm everything. Nothing happens except we go, what's that? The nebula andrometer? There we go. Isn't that interesting? I kept looking at it. I got to push it. The top left thing is the critical thing. If you get stuck and roll, and I believe there's a stuck and roll system here, that's when a fixed roll becomes a repeated, endless pattern that goes on and on and on and gets nowhere. I saw this first and most dramatically in the adolescent homicides in US schools. Thank God you don't have those here now. Young people shooting. First one I had to do with was in a town called Columbine, in a school called Columbine, a town called Littleton. Where a couple of boys that really didn't know how to fire guns. They didn't know anything about detonating bombs. They just went in to have a little fun, got a bit bored, smoked a little pipe, wandered around shooting people. They had been mercilessly bullied. We analysed, I think, 25 school shootings. And in 23 of them, relentless bullying and a sense of being utterly exhausted and sick to death of it created a mindset in these boys that they were going to destroy everything. One of the main perpetrators in Columbine was a boy who had a math scholarship in the 9th grade to college. He was brilliant. He'd memorized the whole Shakespearean play just for fun. He had an A+ grade point average. But he was a lost boy in a crazy school in which the adults could not get themselves together. But that's not another whole story. They stopped switching roles and became what they called avenging angels. I would call stuck in victim role. And I'm not too sure that isn't happening. I know there's disagreement. Pamela and I have talked about this a little bit, as to whether or not the young people who act out so badly, where in spite of the negotiations, the rates of incarceration are going up, not down, are acting out the rage of their parents that cannot be expressed. They're just going crazy. so to speak. Like Klebold and Harris, the two boys who murdered people in Columbine. You know, America has at least 3 school murder rampages every year, 3 to 5. And it doesn't really get much publicity now. Suicide does. But you probably are aware suicide and homicide are flip sides of the same coin. It either goes in or it goes out. We don't want it to get like that. But it could. If we don't get sublimation going here, if we don't get some other way, I'm just terrified as an analyst who's used to dealing with extremely primitive feelings. I mean, I deal with birth trauma on the couch, I deal with extra stuff that you cannot put into words. My fear is that this will suddenly burst out. And I began to think, hoping that it wasn't true, that it's getting worse and worse and worse. So it seems like there's an urgency here. It's not just a matter of we should do this, we need to get along together, we can reconcile. It seems to me somehow there's an urgency necessary to get these sort of figures under better control. This is what happens when a violent mindset gets set up. This essentially was extracted from a study of a fire department, and I may come to. And you'll see there how the individual's work function is affected by a violent mindset. I'll go into the case in a minute. Boredom, arrested growth, rigidity of viewpoint with inability to anticipate problems, forgetting procedures, losing track of process, misjudging people, creating victim-victimizer polarizations, and misjudging boundaries, reduced curiosity and initiative, resentful and enhancement of submissiveness in others, and misjudging people, both their personalities and the meaning of their actions. Well, this is in the US Fire Department. And I think some of this stuff may be present in the elders who are sick of it, in the young people who are sick of it, in my average cab driver who has had enough of it. He wants to get into changing minds, saving lives, and making the spirit inside me good. Now here's how it works, and I thought I'd just bring this in. I use it with schools a lot. To go from low well-being, the current situation in Northern Territory, to high well-being, there has to be a balance of power and responsive thinking, mentalization. The power dynamic roles, if fixed, creates a concrete, non-thinking mental state. That's where I think you're stuck now. If you can move that through and the power dynamic roles become fluid, you'll get true responsive thinking. You will get two sides of the negotiating table being on the same page about what they're talking about. You have to go through humiliation. I would agree with John here that humiliation is extremely destructive, and it has to be openly dealt with. It has to be spoken about and managed. And then you get, according to schools, bystander who's just standing aside saying, I wish this thing would be finished, I'm sick to death of hearing about it, would go away, and you would all become upstanders and join together hand to hand and cheer. I'm not trying to be facetious here, I know I've been. So if you're stuck in role, essentially, the designated leaders step out of role and don't do anything. It sounds just like the Royal Commission. They want not to have this discussed. They leave huge segments of the report out. The bully leaders, and in this instance, the bully leaders are mixed. It seems the police are leaders, but there may well be others who collude, and you would know better than I do. They don't really realize they're leading the system, but the system, the designated leaders, the elected leaders, the appointed leaders are non-functional, and they know they're non-functional because they're not effective. Only thing they can do is suppress information, make sure it's not published, put certain people away, don't promote somebody, or parallel. The US government, what it's great at doing is parallel promotion. In other words, you don't promote a person up, you just promote them out. So they're no longer in your department, so they're no longer a problem to you. And then, if your intervener works, if these two groups begin to speak, then the designated leaders rejoin and mentalize, and the bully leaders rejoin, and they get to feel more than triumphant or in control. They get to feel they have friends. So anymore you don't have to imprison while walking around black. You don't have to have a prison called an abattoir. In other words, you don't just feel triumphant and controlling, you feel like you have friends on the other side. You can't buy friendship. One of the best signs of a transformed system, whether it be a city or a country or an organization, one of the best signs of it is when the bully says, I now have friends. Whatever I used to do, I couldn't buy friendship. I think Saddam Hussein was one of the ones who said that. Then you have what one researcher called an efficacious community. A community functioning in which the people, although they don't necessarily love each other, they know that living together requires the other person, and they acknowledge it. Now, how much more time have I got? 20 minutes? You getting bored yet? I notice if you want to get up and move around a bit. You all right? If I notice too many people going to sleep, I'll get you up and moving around. Okay, now we get down to grips with the actual facts. For what this is worth, I've tried to make my main point. If you're stuck in role, you've got the classic symptoms of it. Whether it's US, New Zealand, I work in Hungary, I work in Jamaica, I work all over the place, Finland, it's all the same. You are not alone. The question now is, I don't know what has to happen next, but something has to happen before reconciliation can occur. I think. And other speakers may well disagree with me. This is an example of a way a Midwest City Council, I'm just going to start with them and we may get through those three examples there. Here's how a good community works. In the center of it is the family. Around it are what we call stabilizing systems. Health, law and order, education, and spirituality. Spirituality does not mean religion. It's another name for altruism. Helping other people. Have any of you done that? Come on, don't be embarrassed. I bet you have. When you do altruistic things, you feel good about yourself. And you're actually healthier. Your immune system will respond better. If those four systems are not working together, in a city they all have budgets and directors, the city will not work. And around it you'll see how it's represented. So our theory is a city or community must have functional stabilizing systems before it can elect good political leaders and before it can have good business. One city, for example, had set up an extraordinary tax break for a group who wanted to build apartment blocks. And the city had paid $144,000 for architects to survey the land. And they were all very excited about this brand new project which would bring jobs and money into the city. And so when the people came, they went and they said, what is this? They started digging down into the land and water. And this is in Kansas. Kansas was built on a lake. And so water is right beneath the surface. They had not surveyed the land properly, being so interested in getting this group. They had created tax breaks and everything and spent all that money as a total waste of time, because they were unstable in their stabilizing systems and they were trying to get money by doing whatever they could do to get it. The same city lost a $9 million grant for low-income housing while arguing about the placement of a $75 compulsory stop sign. Then they called in the shrink, me. By that time, some of them thought something weird was going on in the city. Cut a long story short, the answer is there was something weird going on in the city. What I did was I met with each city council member and bought their lunch, which is very, very important. When you're trying to negotiate with a person who's on the other side of an issue, one of the most important things psychoanalytically that you do is feed them. And I mean this very seriously. Feed them immediately. And the orality causes a lot of soothing. Those of us who have a little trouble with our tummies know very well that we go to the refrigerator and eat when we're stressed. It settles you down. So I got a meeting and I found out what they thought was going on in the city council. And then when I got through all of them, I brought them all together, and it turned out in this city you couldn't have a public meeting. And so a faith group was there, a really weird faith group. Strange religion, but you know, that was the way it was. And they were very helpful. Once they realized there was nothing political going on here. You know what the cure was? And you're probably not going to believe this. But I often wonder if there's somehow we're missing a simple solution here. And here's what happened. I got every city council member to say why they joined the city council. It's not paid very well. There's a huge amount of work, and there's a lot of fighting. And they spoke very, very idealistically about their jobs. And they gave histories of service in communities. And it was a 4-hour meeting, and 3 hours of it was spent people saying, I didn't know, God, John, you don't help little kids. Do you? No, not you. John was we'll just say John was a very frightening person. He was the person that, when the city council was not being televised, they had to bring the security guards in case John attacked one of the women. But John was a very gentle person. He loved children. Nobody knew that about him in spite of years on the city council until he began to speak about himself as a complete human being. I call it subjectification of the object. I will put this to you. You cannot negotiate a settlement or reconcile to a situation without friendship. Without friendship. It has to be personal. If the other side of the table is a role only with no humanness in it, it will not work. I'd like the opinion of the panel about this, but our experience has been there has to be friendship to reconcile. And what do I mean by friendship? I mean, when you like a person well enough to be willing to, well, this is exaggerated, but I remember an Italian friend of mine who lived in the Italian quarter of Boston next to the mafia boss. He said, I'd take a bullet for you, Stuart. A friend will do that. I don't mean lovey-dovey friend, but I mean a friend who will support you. Now, as John's pointed out, trusting to that degree is built up over time. This process is not just going to happen. But it has to develop, the friendship has to develop. In the parking lot after this meeting, the city councils were standing around for 45 minutes hugging each other. The problem between the mayor and the city council, which was complete non-function, they couldn't function at all, make any decision, disappeared. That city council were all all cheers and smiles, and began talked, not on the TV, televised part of it, but some of the other sessions talked about all these misunderstandings. They said, John, I didn't realize you don't need a security guard with you. You're a loving person. You love children. You love people. And so our idea is you've got to get into a depth of relationship with who you are fighting or reconciling with before any of this can go on. And I put it to you, can this happen? Now here's another example. Montego Bay in Jamaica had a massive homicide rate. 20% of the homicides were thought to be done by police. The police corruption was beyond description. It was extraordinary. The police were paid what in the US would be welfare level money, nothing. Police barracks were like a slum. And the police were moved from place to place whenever they were needed. They were treated like dogs, really. And we used a small group of policemen, on the average had been 10 years with the police force, who in spite of this, they were mature men who'd been there quite a long time, was still putting up with those conditions, and we paid special attention to them. And you know what the first thing we did when we went in there? We said, what do you want? What can we help you with? That's what I do with every organization I go to. Tell me about what's going on here. I don't come in with an expert protocol. And they told us. Those people came to us in the morning before we got there. We did the workshops over a week, twice a year in Jamaica. I didn't know till later they had to put 8 hours of service in police work after the workshop during the evening. Never told us that, never complained. I had one particular experience of a policeman I taught an arm lock to, and his general way of doing things was to shoot the people that he arrested. But this man came at him with a machete, a favourite, in Jamaica you do find fingers and toes in the gutter, and the machete, he pulled his gun out and then he remembered this arm lock and he said, oh, I'll try that. So he got the guy on the ground so he couldn't move. There's a way of doing this where if you move, it hurts. So the person just usually sits still. And he began talking to him. He found this man, he'd come home, he'd found his wife in bed with another man. So he'd gotten the rum bottle, and that fires you up. So he went out with his machete flailing. And the policeman talked him down while he was face down on the ground. Got the man up, he thanked him, and he took him home. And he came and told us the next day. Well, cut a long story short, when the police who previously, if they were seen as policemen off duty, they were shot. They were so unpopular, they were called animals. When they left, one of them took me up to the shanty towns, and the people brought out their children to introduce them to the policemen. The policemen were revered in the community. The policemen had set up a house for the homeless men, community uplifting of the mentally ill. They learned that doing good things for people, help them catch real criminals. So there was a capacity developed for altruism and a reconciliation between the police, seen as animals who murder people, and the community of Jamaica. Now, well, here's my colleague talking kids. Here's our police group. I want to show you this guy. Notice anything odd about those two? You notice anything funny about their anatomy? No? What do you think of that guy on the left? Those are wooden hands. He had both arms taken off the shoulder with machete. He's a policeman. Protecting a bunch of children. He threw himself in front of the children and got his arms chopped. And you'll see there, he's back on the police force with artificial arms. Those are what we call peacemakers. Those are ordinary policemen who in the community really take to heart the service they give people remind me, Professor Marcia's, the mindset of those policemen. Can you imagine what is going on in their minds? It's just, I can't imagine it. But these guys became altruistic leaders, and they began getting involved with schools. First time we got into one of the high schools, we took 3 truckloads of weapons off the kid. We frisked every kid. There were rapes and murders on the campus, and incredible. And within about a month, with policemen helping, that school completely settled down. And kids started coming back to school and getting educated. So the police and schools in Jamaica have an intimate link. We're still there in the grill. And finally, I want to mention the fire department. 5 minutes? This fire chief had been appointed. He was a Marine. Any of you know Marines? The fire, what are they called? I can't remember what they call themselves. They're sort of snotty sounding. But they're the tough guys of the American police force. You have to be able to do 40 pull-ups. Anybody can do 40 pull-ups? Well, that's a minimum. Women, 15. And most people can't do 5. Maybe 1 or 2. Anyway, they're tough guys. And he came into the police as a fire chief, and he began organising them just like Marines. And when I came into it, he had just arranged to build a bulletproof wall around his office because there had been murders of fire chiefs by deputy fire chiefs. And he was getting ready to be shot. This is America. And what had happened, I got into 100 men who wanted to kill him by myself, and I took into myself that rage, and I thought I had cancer. And I'm not a person who develops symptomatology very easily. I don't get headaches, stomach aches, only backaches when somebody kicks me in the back. I thought I had cancer, and I had to go to the emergency room immediately. It was the illness of that murderous group that made me feel completely out of control. They did a vote of no confidence in it, and that's how we came into the picture. The fire department have a very complex lineage. The police don't like them generally because fire departments only do good things, and police have to do bad things as well as good things. So fire departments get it easy. Now, they fear mostly change. They fear change. So we intervened, and all we did was we got the chief and we said, send every memo you're going to send out to one of us. There may be like a 5-second consultation. And all we did was make it less like a military order. Make it a little bit more friendly. And the whole place changed. And I got him, get this, you'll love this, Eve. I got him a paper, Margaret Rio's paper on Bion's basic assumption groups, written in 1978. And this is, by the way, a sign that some people can understand Bion. That fire chief understood him. To this day, that is in his briefcase. He reads it every day. Once he read it, he said, this is it. Psychoanalyst, you guys. And then he created this. The evil chief syndrome, if you read it through. And he ended up being the most popular fire chief in the state of Massachusetts. He went around starting up fire departments, and the first thing he did was evil chief syndrome. This is what's going to happen if you let yourself be overwhelmed by the games of management, and if you are not aware that you are the container of people's fantasies, they're inside you, and it's not you. If you're not aware of that, you will develop the evil chief syndrome. Well, those are a few examples only. And I don't want us to be like this New Yorker cartoon. The silliness of it is what in the end these two people have, one sees a boat and the other sees land, is really nothing. Nobody's going to rescue us from this. So let me just stop at that point and Thank you for listening. I know it's been rambling. I've tried to integrate some of what I've learned today and also try and keep myself as polite as possible. Was anybody offended? See, the fighting spirit has to come out. Not the punching spirit, but the spirit that says, this can't go on. You have it, Professor Marcia. You need not to be alone. You're alone. There needs to be intelligent, well-educated people standing up for you. And the same with the Aboriginal elders. Come out and say something. Get what Pamela said. I like the idea of the fighting spirit. So let's start fighting again in a constructive way that may set the scene for later reconciliation. Thank you.